Let's talk about one of the biggest problems in the way that arises in when people are collecting data, and that is bias. Okay, and bias is just this kind of overarching term that refers to when the data collected does not represent the population for some reason or another. Doesn't Who knows? There could be all kinds of reasons, but when our sample and the data we collect does not represent the population as a whole, then we have bias. Now, there are a lot of different sources of bias, and we're going to talk about here kind of the biggest ones. So, first of all, we've got sampling bias. So, sampling bias results from our sampling technique, okay? And that's just the sample that we have, okay? For whatever reason, our sample is not representative of the population. So, the sample itself, the way we picked it, doesn't represent the population, then we're going to have some bias, and that's called sampling bias. Next is voluntary response bias. Okay, this what happens when the sample is a voluntary response sample, because the information we're getting is just from individuals that have volunteered to participate and chosen to be in the sample, and so then that's not going to be representative of the entire population. So that's our voluntary response bias. Next is when we have a self-interest study. This is when the study is being performed by people that actually have a vested interest in the outcome of the study. So, for example, maybe I, as a teacher, I am interested to know how my teaching technique influences individual learning. Well, I have a vested interest in that, right? I personally think that my teaching is going to be effective, if that's what I'm choosing to do. And so that's probably not going to be a very good study. And so then that's when I've got some bias due to self-interest. Next is response bias. So this is bias that results from responses themselves, when the responder gives inaccurate responses for any reason. Now, this doesn't have to be intentionally inaccurate. It could just be because people have forgotten. Maybe you're asking individuals to recall something from their childhood, and they give you answers that don't actually end up being true, but they just don't actually remember, so they think that they're telling you something true, even though it's not. Or it could be response bias because they just want to lie, or they're embarrassed about how they feel about something or whatever. That's response bias, when the responses themselves are not actually accurate. Next is the perceived lack of anonymity. Okay, this is when the responder fears giving an honest answer because it might negatively affect them. This could be maybe I, as a teacher, ask my students to rate my teaching, and they're going to write their name on a paper and tell me what they think. Well, they don't think that they don't. My students don't feel that they have anonymity. They're not going to be completely honest because they think, oh, maybe it's going to affect my grade and I don't want that to happen or whatever. So that's perceived lack of anonymity. That's going to result in some bias. Next is loaded questions. Loaded questions are where the way that the question is worded actually will influence the responses. And so, maybe a political poll, like, wouldn't you agree that it's better to fill in the blank? Saying wouldn't you agree is going to make people think that they should be agreeing, and there's something wrong with not agreeing, and so that's going to skew the results. And finally, we've got non-response bias. And non-response bias is where the people that do not participate in the study actually will influence the validity of the outcome. And so maybe the people participating in a study, or the people conducting a study, maybe the researchers, are known to be from an organization that has specific views. And when someone finds out about that and they don't agree, they refuse to participate. Okay. So, for example, I have a sister that's a professor in the marriage and family. She's a marriage and family therapist. She's a professor at BYU, which is, of course, a church-owned school with very conservative views. And they're conducting a very large study right now, but there are people that refuse to participate in the study because they know that it's BYU conducting the study and they don't want to be a part of it. And so that's going to skew their results a little bit. So that's non-response bias. Let's see if we can identify these different sources of bias. Consider a recent study which found that chewing gum may raise math grades in teenagers. The study was conducted by the Wrigley Science Institute, a branch of the Wrigley Chewing Gum Company. So if you're reading this, it should be a red flag pretty quickly, right? Oh, Wrigley Chewing Gum. They did the study and found that chewing gum can raise math grades. Well, obviously that seems like a self-interest study, right? The people conducting the study obviously have a vested interest in the outcome because, well, if people think that chewing gum is going to improve math grades, then they may chew gum more. I mean, they're going to buy more Wrigley chewing gum. Okay, so this is a self-interest study. Okay, let's look at the next one. A survey asks people, when was the last time you visited your doctor? Now, there's a lot of things that can go on here. First of all, I personally don't remember the last time I visited my doctor. So if I were to answer this question, then there would be probably some response bias because I don't remember, so I would be guessing. Okay, so there could be some response bias here. Okay, but there could be some other sources of bias. Perhaps it has been years and years and years and years and years since someone visited their doctor, and they feel guilty about that, or they're ashamed. They think it's kind of embarrassing that I haven't gone to a doctor in so long and made sure that I'm okay. And so maybe then there would be some response bias in that case as well. Or perhaps someone's at the doctor and the doctor asks them, when was the last time you came? And they know that their response is, obviously not anonymous since their doctor's asking them. And so that could be a perceived lack of anonymity. Okay. And so, obviously there can be a lot of different reasons, different types of bias. Next, a survey asks participants a question about their interactions with members of other races. Okay, well, there are, again, reasons that here people may not want to answer honestly. Maybe they're embarrassed. And so in that case, there could again be some response bias. Or, maybe the people that are actually responding to this or are a certain type of person, and some people aren't involved in the sample. They refuse to participate because it's something about race and they don't want to do that. And so maybe there's some non-response bias. Or maybe the person, maybe there's a white person asking a black person, and the black person has a perceived lack of anonymity because a white person's asking them, and they don't want to be honest about it, or vice versa. Maybe the survey is being conducted by a civil rights group, in which case it might be a self-interest study because how they are going to use it is obviously in line with their goals. So again, lots of different possibilities as far as bias here. An employer puts out a survey asking their employees if they have a drug abuse problem and need treatment. Well, this employer is asking employees about something that unfortunately might influence their working ability and how they're perceived at work. And so this, of course, could be a perceived lack of anonymity. which of course was going to lead to maybe their answers aren't truthful. And so there's some response bias. It doesn't tell us if this was mandatory. Okay, the employer just puts out a survey asking employees if they have a drug abuse problem. So maybe some people are not even responding. So maybe we get some non-response bias and some voluntary response bias. It sounds like a loaded question to me. Okay, do you have a drug abuse problem and need treatment help? Well, that's leading in a direction, right? Well, if you have a drug abuse problem, then you need help. People that have a drug abuse problem may not think that they need help. So of course, this lots of different ways there can be bias. Next, the survey asks, do you support funding research of alternative energy sources to reduce our reliance on high polluting fossil fuels? First and foremost, this should seem like a loaded question. It certainly is. There's a lot of things going on here. First of all, there's do you support? Okay, the word support makes people thinking, oh, I should support it. Next is high polluting fossil fuels. Well, anything high polluting obviously is negative. And so this is going to be a loaded question. Because it's obviously looking for a certain answer. Now, asking better questions, you could reword this question. You could say, do you support or are you opposed to? Do you support or oppose funding research of alternative energy sources to reduce reliance on fossil fuels, take out the high polluting? There are ways to make questions or try and make questions less loaded. Now, of course, the responses to this question could be, there could be some response bias here as well, because people feel guilty about answering one way or the other. Maybe there's a perceived lack of anonymity. Maybe there's some maybe it's a self-interest study. We don't know who's asking this this question. Next, a telephone poll asks the question, do you often have time to relax and read a book? And 50% of the people called refused to answer the survey. Well, initially, right away here, we see, people are refusing to answer the survey. So that's obviously non-response bias, because there are people refusing here, non-response. And, those people probably have different answers to this, because people that do have time to relax and read a book probably have more time to respond to a telephone poll. And then, of course, on the other hand of that is people that don't have time probably don't have time to answer questions in a telephone survey. And so you're missing out on those answers. There's also some sampling bias here. It's a telephone poll, and so it's only sampling people that have a telephone where the number is available, and whatever. Maybe if they have an unlisted number and their numbers are not out there, then they can't be part of it. And so that's going to be some sampling bias as well. Next, we've got a radio station asking readers to phone in their choice in a daily poll. So right off the bat, a radio station is asking people to participate here. And so that's some voluntary response. So we've got some voluntary response bias happening here. Response bias. We don't know what the poll is actually about, the daily poll. It could be about something that's radio specific, but maybe it's something general, maybe about a political preference or something. In which case, then there's going to be some sampling bias, because they're only getting people they're just picking their sample based on who's listening to their radio station. So there could be some sampling bias here. Or maybe it's there's some response or non-response bias, because people are refusing to participate because they don't have time to call in for some silly radio poll. Lots of different possibilities always for bias. A substitute teacher wants to know how students in the class did on their last test. So the teacher asks the 10 students sitting on the front row to state their latest test score. This is sampling bias. Super easy to see that because the people chosen are obviously not representative of the class as a whole. People sitting in the front row tend to be different types of students that are sitting in the back than students that are sitting in the back row. There's also probably some response bias here because these students are just being asked to just say what their test score was, and maybe they're embarrassed about their test score, and they want to they don't want people to know how bad they did, or maybe not even know how good they did, and so there can be some response bias there. Obviously, a perceived lack of anonymity since they're just being asked directly, and so there's no level of anonymity there. Next, we've got high school students asked if they have consumed alcohol in the last 2 weeks. Lots of issues here, right? There's obviously going to be some response bias. High school students that are consuming alcohol probably aren't going to be honest about it. There's probably going to be a perceived lack of anonymity because, well, whoever's asking this may have some power over what happens to them. So we've got some response bias, perceived lack of anonymity, perceived lack of anonymity. And so I would be very hesitant to trust any responses from a question like this. Next, the Beef Council releases a study stating that consuming red meat poses little cardiovascular risk. Well, if the Beef Council is telling you about eating beef, then that should send up the red flags. This is clearly a self-interest study. Self-interest study. Because the person reporting on the study is obviously interested in you eating more red meats. And so probably couldn't be trusted. A poll asks, do you support a new transportation tax, or would you prefer to see our public transportation system fall apart? This question, obviously, it's giving you kind of a false dichotomy, right? You've got... they're saying you've got two options: either support the new tax or public transportation falls apart, which obviously has a negative connotation. This is the classic example of a loaded question. Now, loaded questions always are going to end up leading to some response bias, maybe perceived lack of anonymity. People just aren't, you're not going to get honest answers. So, when you're trying to establish how a sample feels about something, you don't want to use loaded questions because then you're just not getting anything that's accurate. And you wouldn't have any confidence in what you've discovered. You wouldn't have discovered anything. So you want to make sure that you're asking questions that are clear, unambiguous, and not tilted one way or the other.